There is an animal so ordinary that we have stopped seeing it. It lives on every continent except one. It outnumbers every other bird on Earth by a margin that defies comprehension. And for most of human history, we thought we understood exactly where it came from. We were wrong. The story of how the chicken became the chicken, how a wild jungle bird transformed into the most widespread domesticated animal in human history, seemed settled. It had been told confidently in textbooks, repeated in lecture halls, cited in archaeological surveys across decades. The narrative was clean, the timeline was organized, and the origin point was pinned to a specific place on the map with something that looked like certainty. Then ancient DNA arrived. And the map became something far more complicated. The origin was not where we thought it was. The timeline was not what we had measured. And the journey from wild bird to global food animal turned out to be one of the most unexpected, most layered, and most revealing stories in the entire history of human civilization. Not just because of what the chickens carried in their genomes, but because of what that genome quietly preserved about us. For most of the 20th century, the accepted story went something like this. The domestic chicken, Gallus domesticus, descended from the red jungle fowl, a wild bird native to South and Southeast Asia. That part was not wrong. But what followed from that assumption began to harden into something more specific. Researchers believed that domestication happened once, in a single region, roughly 10,000 years ago, probably in the area we now call China or northern Southeast Asia. From there, the chickens spread outward, carried by human migration and trade along routes that eventually circled the entire globe. It was a tidy story. It matched the timeline of other early agricultural animals. It gave archaeologists a starting point and historians a narrative arc. The chicken was domesticated once. It spread outward. Done. Archaeologists pointed to early bone finds from China and Thailand as evidence. Linguists traced the word for chicken through language families back toward the region. Everything seemed to fit. The origin box was checked, the file was closed, and the chicken took its place in the standard account of the Neolithic agricultural revolution. But there was a problem. Several problems, actually. They were small at first. Easy to explain away. Then they weren't. The first friction appeared not in a laboratory but in the dirt. When archaeologists began to look more carefully at the earliest supposed chicken remains from Europe and the Near East, something seemed off. Bones that had been dated to thousands of years before the supposed domestication window were being reconsidered. Many of them, upon closer inspection, turned out to be misidentified, bones from other birds, bones from later periods, bones disturbed by soil movement over millennia. The confident early dates began to collapse. Then came the realization that assumptions had been baked into the analysis. When researchers in Europe found bird bones near human settlements and near cereal grain deposits, they had assumed the chickens must have come there for food. But other possibilities had been overlooked. Wild jungle fowl and early domesticated birds might have been drawn to human agricultural areas because grain was abundant, not because they were raised as livestock. The relationship between early humans and early chickens might not have been about eating at all. There were other clues that something was being missed. In many of the oldest sites where chicken remains appeared, the birds showed up not in cooking deposits but in ritual contexts. Burials. Ceremonial pits. Sites where objects of symbolic importance were placed. This was not the pattern of a food animal. It was the pattern of something else entirely. The accepted story had assumed chickens were domesticated for meat and eggs. But the evidence was quietly suggesting a different possibility. One that would only become clear when the ancient DNA finally arrived. Genetics entered the story in fragments. A bone here, a tooth there, a feather preserved by remarkable luck in a waterlogged site. Ancient DNA research on chickens accelerated through the 2010s and into the 2020s, driven by improvements in sequencing technology that allowed researchers to extract and read genetic material from specimens that would have been considered unusable just a decade earlier. What the tools offered was extraordinary. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited through the maternal line, could tell researchers about ancestry passed through mothers over thousands of years. Y chromosome markers could trace the paternal line. Whole genome sequencing could reveal the full mosaic of ancestry, admixture events, bottlenecks, and population replacements that bones and stones alone could never show. Ancient DNA was, in essence, a molecular archive. Every chicken that had ever lived left traces of its ancestors in its genome, and those traces pointed somewhere researchers had not fully expected. If you enjoy stories like this, where science quietly rewrites what we thought we knew, consider subscribing. There is a great deal more hidden history still waiting in the genome. The first major disruption came from a collaboration of researchers who gathered ancient chicken bones from dozens of sites across Europe and the Near East, extracted DNA from the samples, and compared them against reference genomes from modern chicken populations and their wild ancestors. The results did not confirm the simple, single-origin model. What the data showed was that early European chickens, birds that appeared in the archaeological record during the Bronze Age and Iron Age, carried genetic signatures that suggested they had arrived in a very specific window of time, far more recently than some earlier estimates had proposed. More than that, their genomes showed clear signals of descent from Southeast Asian populations, not from the South Asian subcontinent or from China directly. But that was only the beginning of the complication. Because when researchers began mapping where those Southeast Asian signals actually clustered, they found something that shifted the entire frame of the question. The strongest signal pointed toward a region that had been somewhat underappreciated in the chicken domestication literature. Not northern China, not the Indus Valley, but mainland Southeast Asia, what is today Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and the surrounding region. That was not a complete surprise to everyone. But what followed was, several explanatory frameworks emerged to make sense of the accumulating evidence. The first proposed a single domestication event in mainland Southeast Asia, somewhere in the vicinity of what researchers identified as the geographic heart of the red junglefowl ancestral range. Under this model, chickens were domesticated once, in one place, probably no earlier than around 3,000 to 4,000 years before the current era, far more recently than the 10,000-year estimate that had been accepted for decades. From there, they moved rapidly through human trade networks, reaching South Asia, then the Near East, then Europe and Africa, and eventually, through maritime routes, reaching the Pacific. The second framework proposed something more complex. Multiple independent domestication events, perhaps in separate regions of Asia, with subsequent gene flow between those populations blurring the boundaries. Under this model, the modern domestic chicken was not descended from one founding population but from several wild populations that were each independently brought into human settlement, and then, over time, merged through trade, warfare, migration, and cultural exchange into the genetically blended animal we recognize today. The third framework, more speculative but supported by some of the ancient DNA signals, suggested that the story of chicken domestication was inseparable from the story of rice agriculture. As humans in Southeast Asia developed paddy farming systems, wild junglefowl were drawn into the agricultural landscape, first as opportunistic foragers near grain stores, then as semi-domesticated animals, and finally as fully domesticated ones. Under this model, domestication was not a single event but a slow, gradual process of ecological entanglement between a bird and a farming culture, playing out over centuries rather than generations. None of these frameworks can fully be declared the winner yet. The evidence is still accumulating. But the old story, clean, simple, early, and singular, is no longer viable. The landmark study that shifted the field most dramatically arrived in 2022, published by a large international team that assembled one of the most comprehensive ancient chicken DNA datasets ever constructed. The researchers analyzed hundreds of ancient specimens spanning thousands of years, from sites in Europe, the Near East, South Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia. They combined the ancient DNA analysis with radiocarbon dating to build a timeline of when and where domesticated chickens actually appeared. What they found upended the accepted chronology entirely. The oldest securely dated domesticated chicken remains, confirmed by both morphological analysis and radiocarbon dating, did not come from China 10,000 years ago. They came from a site in Southeast Asia, dated to around 1650 BCE at the earliest. The remains in Europe that had once been cited as ancient evidence of early chicken domestication were dramatically younger than previously believed. Many of the bones that had appeared to be ancient were recontextualized to much later periods. The timeline of chicken domestication had been compressed by thousands of years. And the reason that timeline had been distorted for so long turned out to be telling. Many of the early bone deposits that researchers had attributed to domestic chickens were found near grain storage sites. The team concluded that wild jungle fowl, not yet domesticated, had been drawn into early agricultural settlements by the presence of stored cereal crops. Their bones ended up mixed with human deposits not because humans were raising them, but because the birds were following the food. The commensal pathway. A wild bird, attracted to a human food source, living alongside humans for generations before domestication fully occurred. That was not the contradiction. That was the signal. The twist in the chicken's genomic story is not just about geography or timing. It is about purpose. For most of recorded Western history, the assumption was that chickens were primarily domesticated as a food animal. Meat and eggs. Protein and agriculture. That story fitted neatly into the narrative of the Neolithic Revolution. Humans domesticated animals to eat them, and the chicken was simply the bird that followed. But when researchers examined the ancient sites where early domestic chickens appeared in the West, in Greece, in Rome, in the Celtic world, in the Norse regions, they found a pattern that did not fit the food animal story. Chickens in many of the earliest European and Near Eastern contexts were found in graves. They were found in votive deposits. They were found in ritual spaces associated with gods and divination. The Romans famously used chickens for augury, reading the behavior of sacred chickens to forecast the outcomes of battles and political decisions. The Norse buried chickens with the dead. In many Iron Age sites across Europe and the Near East, there is almost no evidence that chickens were being eaten at all. The bones show no butchering marks. They were not broken for marrow. They were placed whole, often alongside other objects of symbolic power. The genome confirmed what the burial record had been whispering. For years, early European chickens were not food. They were sacred animals. They arrived in Europe not through the agricultural trade network but through a different kind of cultural exchange, the movement of ideas, rituals, and symbolic objects between civilizations. And they remained primarily ritual animals for centuries before gradually becoming the food commodity they are today. Not the timeline researchers expected. Not even the function they expected. What the chicken's hidden genomic history actually reveals is something much larger than poultry. It reveals how confidently wrong the old frameworks could be when they were built on assumptions rather than evidence. Researchers had assumed early dates because the bones were present. They had assumed food use because the animal eventually became food. They had assumed single origin because single origins were conceptually tidy. And in each case, the assumption closed off a question that the evidence had never actually answered. Ancient DNA does not lie in the same way that narrative can. It cannot be shaped by the preferences of a tradition or the expectations of a consensus. It carries what it carries, the actual biological record of who mated with whom, where populations moved, when admixture occurred, and how populations changed over time. And what that record shows, again and again, is that the human past is not linear. It is not clean. Animals, like people, moved in unexpected directions, were absorbed into cultures far from their origin, carried meanings and purposes that changed dramatically across time and geography. The story of the chicken is a story about how a wild bird and a human civilization grew together in a relationship that was never simply transactional. It was ritual. It was symbolic. It was ecological. And only much later was it culinary. Imagine standing at the edge of a rice paddy somewhere in mainland Southeast Asia, 3,500 years ago. The evening air is thick. The paddies reflect the last light of day. And at the edge of the field, moving through the tall grass with a kind of nervous elegance, a red jungle fowl pauses, tilts its head, and watches the settlement. The grain stores are nearby. The fires are burning. Humans and birds have been sharing this landscape for generations. No one has decided anything. No one has made a choice. But something is changing, slowly, wordlessly, through proximity and survival and the quiet logic of ecological overlap. The bird is not yet tamed. The human has not yet decided to tame it. But the entanglement has already begun. That bird's descendants would eventually stand in every village, every city, every nation on Earth. They would be painted on Greek vases, buried with Norse warriors, and eventually shipped in billions across every ocean. And they would carry, compressed into their genome, the memory of that original landscape, the paddy fields, the grain, the cautious distance that slowly, over centuries, became something more. The origin of the chicken was never as simple as a place on a map or a date on a calendar. It was a process. A long, messy, contingent entanglement between a species that was good at surviving near humans and a species that was good at finding uses for whatever lived nearby. The genome has not closed the question. If anything, it has opened it further. Researchers are still working to untangle the multiple domestication events, the gene flow between populations, the role of different junglefowl subspecies in shaping the modern bird. The story continues to get more complicated as more ancient specimens are analyzed. And that complexity is not a failure of science. It is the honest shape of history. What the old narrative gave us was a domestication event. A moment, a place, a people. What the ancient DNA is giving us instead is a process. A gradual, continent-spanning, millennia-long negotiation between species, full of unexpected turns, ritual meanings, symbolic power, and the kind of deep, ecological relationship that does not reduce neatly to a table of dates and origins. The chicken was never simply domesticated. It was encountered, adapted to, drawn in, elevated to sacred status, traded across civilizations, gradually repurposed, and ultimately transformed by 10,000 years of human ingenuity and human hunger. The genome preserved what history forgot. And what it preserved is not a simpler story. It is a far older one. If stories like this leave you thinking differently about the animals, the histories, and the assumptions we carry without question, subscribe. There are many more revelations still waiting in the deep archive of ancient DNA.